The train hissed to a halt with a screech of steel, and the last curl of smoke drifted like a ghost above the station. Dust swirled in the fading light, wrapping itself around a slender young woman who stepped off with hesitant feet. Her gloved hands clutched a worn satchel pressed tight against her chest, as if the fabric could shield her from the weight of 100 eyes that weren't even looking at her. The station smelled of sweat, coal, and something sharper, fear perhaps, or maybe it was just her own breath catching in her throat. She had come west seeking promise, but the desert wind whispered only danger. Her name mattered little here, she thought. Back east, it had been a name tied to a small town, a mother's prayers, and the ache of hunger gnawing through too many winters. Now it was just a word scribbled on a letter, exchanged with a stranger. He had called himself a rancher, a man of the land, promising security and a roof over her head. The ink had been stiff and curt, but it had carried the hope her mother insisted was worth chasing. She had folded that hope into her satchel, tucked between her last dress and a Bible, and boarded the train with trembling resolve. Her journey had been long, and every clack of the wheels seemed to drum out the same question. What if the stories were true? There were whispers that some brides vanished into the lawless wastes, stolen by bandits or worse. She told herself that courage was not the absence of fear, but the act of stepping forward in spite of it. Yet as she climbed into the waiting wagon, driven by a wiry man with a hat pulled low over his brow, her courage felt thinner than parchment. The wagon rattled along the dirt road, each bump a reminder of how far she had traveled from safety. The driver chewed tobacco and spat, muttering about riders who prowled the canyons. Coyotes howled in the distance, their cries sharp against the stillness. She tightened her grip on her satchel, knuckles whitening. At one bend, shadows moved quick along a ridge. The driver cursed, snapping the reins, urging the horses into a desperate gallop. The wagon lurched violently, and she nearly tumbled into the dust. Her heart thundered. She dared not look back, whether it had been bandits or just trick of light. She could not say, but when the chase ended, she sat shaking, silent, her throat too dry for words. By the time the ranch appeared on the horizon, her nerves were frayed raw. It did not look like the sanctuary she had pictured. Fences sagged, some splintered and broken, and the barn stood hunched like an old man too weary to straighten. The land stretched vast, unforgiving, marked by patches of brittle grass and the occasional skeletal tree. The man who emerged from the shadows of the porch was broad-shouldered, his face etched with lines that looked carved rather than grown. A scar across his jaw like a reminder of battles he'd rather forget. His eyes were guarded, and when they met hers, she felt no welcome, only caution. Their introduction was stiff. He spoke few words, his voice gravelly, as though rust had grown over from years of disuse. She tried to offer a smile, but it wilted when he turned away too quickly, leading her toward the house without a glance. She stepped into the cabin and smelled smoke, wood, and loneliness all tangled together. The walls seemed heavy with silence. It pressed in on her, making her wonder if she had made a grave mistake. Night fell swift, bringing with it a cold that seeped into her bones. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed, Bible clutched in her lap, whispering prayers that wavered between fear and pleading. Then came the noise, a crack in the dark like distant gunfire. Her breath caught. Another sound followed, closer, a shuffle at the door. The hinges moaned and her pulse leapt. She pressed herself back against the headboard, every muscle taut, expecting danger to stride in. But it was no outlaw, no shadow of menace. It was a child. A little girl stood barefoot in the doorway, her nightdress brushing the floor, hair tangled like wild grass. She crept forward without hesitation, eyes wide yet steady, and her small hands clutched the hem of the woman's dress. The bride's breath shuddered out, relief mixing with bewilderment. Before she could speak, the girl whispered, her voice soft but piercing as a blade to the heart. "Can you be Mama?" The question hung in the air, fragile and heavy all at once. The cabin seemed to hold its breath. The bride stared, speechless, feeling the weight of every mile she had traveled, every prayer her mother had sent her, every fear that had clawed at her chest. And now here was this child, looking up with desperate hope. She felt something shift deep within her, something that frightened her more than outlaws ever could. The night stayed silent after the question, but the silence was no longer empty. It was filled with possibility, with grief, and with the faintest flicker of belonging. The woman knew sleep would not come, not after words like those. Instead, she sat frozen, the child curled at her side, and wondered if destiny had already chosen her path before she ever stepped off the train. Morning crept over the plains like a reluctant promise. The sky washed pale gold, the air crisp enough to sting the lungs. She woke to the sound of a rooster's cry and the weight of the child pressed against her arm, as if the girl had refused to let go even in sleep. For a moment she watched the child's slow breaths, the innocence etched across her small face, and something within her softened. Yet the softness brought with it a gnawing dread. This was not her family, not her child, not her life. She rose quietly, though the little one stirred, rubbing her eyes and mumbling a wordless greeting. In the kitchen, the rancher stood by the stove, pouring black coffee into a tin mug. His movements were deliberate, steady, as if each gesture carried the weight of habit rather than thought. He offered her no smile, only a curt nod, and she felt the sting of being unwelcome. But then the girl came running, clutching her skirt, and he bent briefly to scoop the child into one arm, his face softening for a fleeting instant. The woman realized then that his distance was not cruelty, but a kind of armor. He carried grief like a man carries a scar. It showed only when the light struck at the right angle. Overbred, too stale to enjoy, he spoke at last. His words were spare, clipped, but heavy with meaning. His wife had died the year before, taken by fever during a raid that left the household broken and the ranch vulnerable. He did not say he had sent for her. He did not say he wanted her. Instead, he apologized for the child's intrusion the night before, his voice lowering as though confessing sin. She swallowed her reply, caught between relief and fresh unease. The days settled into a rhythm of labor, the kind that stretched bone and spirit alike. She fetched water from the well, her hands blistering around the handle of the bucket. She scattered feed for the chickens, wincing when the rooster snapped at her heels. Dust clung to her skirts and hair until she could hardly remember the feel of being clean. The sun burned merciless, yet she found herself taking quiet pride in each task completed. The girl trailed after her, a constant shadow, her laughter brightening moments that might otherwise have broken her resolve. Still, fear was never far. She overheard whispers when the rancher met with neighbors at the fence line, words like outlaws, land grabbers, and trouble brewing carried easily across the dry wind. Once, while drawing water, she spotted figures on horseback against the horizon, silhouettes like dark birds circling. Her stomach knotted. She ducked her head and prayed they would vanish into the heat haze, though she knew shadows rarely left without returning. Even in the shadow of danger, there were moments that surprised her. One morning she attempted to milk the cow, mimicking motion she had only seen, not practiced. The animal snorted, shifted, and with a swift kick sent the pail flying, splattering milk across her dress. She shrieked, then clamped a hand over her mouth in embarrassment. The little girl laughed so hard she toppled into the hay, her giggles echoing through the barn. For the first time since stepping off the train, the bride laughed too, helpless and breathless, as if the sound had been buried and forgotten inside her. The rancher, leaning in the doorway, allowed a faint smile to tug at his scarred face before quickly masking it again. As the nights grew colder, the child insisted on stories before sleep. The woman obliged, her voice weaving tales from memory and imagination. She spoke of brave girls who tamed wild horses, of lonely travelers who found families in unexpected places, of tiny miracles hidden in ordinary days. The child would curl into her, whispering, "You smell like home," before drifting off. Those words clung to her heart, stirring a longing she had tried to bury. But peace could not hold forever. One evening, the rancher returned from town with his jaw clenched tight. He did not speak over supper, and she felt the tension thrum like a string pulled too taut. Later, she heard him outside, the crunch of boots pacing restless circles. She pressed an ear to the wall and caught fragments, demands for his land, men threatening more raids, the sheriff unable to intervene. Fear seeped back into her bones, cold and sharp. The unease grew heavier in the following days. She noticed how the rancher kept his rifle within reach, how the horses grew restless at night, how the child clung tighter to her skirts. The bride found herself listening for hoofbeats in the distance, for the crack of gunfire, for any sign that danger was about to burst through the fragile shelter they had built. One night, as she tucked the girl beneath a quilt, a storm rolled across the plains. Lightning split the sky, and thunder growled low and steady. The child's eyes widened with fright, but instead of hiding under the blanket, she buried her face against a woman's chest. The bride stroked her tangled hair, murmuring comfort she did not fully believe. She realized then that the bond between them was no accident. The girl had chosen her. She had stepped into the role of mother, without meaning to, and the weight of it pressed sweet and terrifying on her heart. The storm passed, but the dread did not. Just before dawn, the sound of gunfire cracked through the night air. The bride jolted awake, heart hammering. Shouts carried across the yard, rough voices blending with the frantic bawl of cattle. She grabbed the child and pulled her under the kitchen table, pressing a finger to her lips. The door rattled, boots stomped against the porch, and shadows moved beyond the thin walls. She clutched the girl close, every muscle trembling, listening to each step draw nearer. The table's wooden legs were no shield, yet it was all she had. Her breath came shallow. The child sobbed muffled against her dress. Then came the unmistakable crunch of a boot on the floorboards above them. Someone was inside, and in that moment, she realized terror could not be fled from. It had already found its way into her very marrow. The cabin shook with violence as the door splintered inward, the crash echoing like thunder across the plains. Rough voices barked commands, laughter jagged and cruel. She held the child tighter, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might give her away. The rancher's rifle fired once, twice, sharp reports that rattled her bones. Hooves thundered outside, cattle bawled in terror, and the air filled with the acrid stench of gunpowder and smoke. She wanted to close her eyes, but the child's trembling body anchored her to the present. If she faltered, the girl would have nothing. The fight surged like a storm. Bullets tore through the walls, with splintering around them. A lamp toppled and shattered, flames licking hungrily at the floor before being smothered by a boot. The rancher's voice roared commands through the chaos, not to her, but to the neighbors who had rushed to his aid. Their gunfire joined his, a defiant chorus against the raiders. She could not see his face, but she could hear the strain, the pain woven into each shout. The realization struck her like a blow. This man, wounded or not, would die before surrendering his land. When the shooting slowed, she risked a glance. The rancher staggered, clutching his shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers. Without thought, she crawled from under the table, dragging the girl with her, and pressed him down before he could protest. Her hands shook as she tore strips from her dress to bind his wound. She had tended her mother in her last illness, had learned how to keep flesh from tearing wider, how to press firmly until bleeding slowed. The memory burned bitter, but it steadied her. His eyes met hers, hard at first, then softening with something she could not name. The outlaws retreated into the darkness, leaving behind trampled ground and fear thick as smoke. For a brief span of silence, only the wind moved, rattling the shutters. The neighbors muttered promises to return at first light, then melted away into the shadows. She helped the rancher to his bed, his weight heavy against her. The child hovered close, eyes wide with fear and hope both, clinging to her skirt. The night felt endless. She tended the wound again by lamplight, her hands damp with blood, her lips pressed tight to keep from shaking. At last he spoke, his voice rough with exhaustion. "You weren't supposed to be here." The words landed like stones. She froze, unsure whether to be angry or ashamed. His gaze drifted toward the child before returning to her. "It wasn't me who sent for you. My wife's sister wrote those letters. She thought a new bride might save the ranch, and the girl—" His breath caught. I didn't have the heart to stop it. Betrayal rose hot in her chest. She had crossed half a continent on the promise of a man who had not even wanted her. She wanted to scream, to hurl the words back at him, but the sight of his pale face and the child's small hand resting on his arm muted her fury. Her silence stretched long, until at last she turned away, feeling the sting of tears she would not shed where he could see. Later, in the quiet after the storm, the girl curled beside her, whispering through tears, "Don't go. Mama said someone would come. She said we wouldn't be alone forever. The words pierced deeper than bullets. The woman felt her resolve cracking, her old loneliness rushing back to meet the child's plea. She remembered nights in her mother's house, praying someone might appear to save them from hunger and grief. No one had come then. Perhaps this was her chance to be the answer instead of the one left behind. But dawn brought no peace. Riders returned, this time not firing blindly, but carrying torches and threats. From the porch, their leader called out, voice dripping with mockery. He offered the rancher a choice, sell the land or watch it burn. When silence met his demand, he laughed, a cruel sound that sent shivers down her spine. He rode closer, his horse kicking up dust, and his eyes settled on her where she stood in the doorway. His grin widened, yellow teeth flashing. Well now, he drawled, look at this. Didn't know you'd gone and got yourself a new bride. Pretty thing like you don't belong out here. His hand shot out, catching her wrist before she could move. The grip was iron, bruising her skin. Fear surged hot, but beneath it a spark of anger flared. She jerked back, but he only laughed, yanking her closer. The child cried out, darting forward, only to be pulled back by the rancher's weak but desperate hand. For a heartbeat the world seemed to balance on a knife's edge. The outlaw's leer, the girl's sobs, the rancher's blood-stained fingers clawing at the ground. The bride's breath came quick, her pulse hammering. She had been afraid since the moment she stepped off the train, but now she felt something new rising, sharp and unyielding. The outlaw leaned closer, his voice a sneer in her ear. You do better with me, sweetheart. This place ain't worth dying for. Her answer came not in words, but in the fire that blazed behind her eyes. The fear was still there, but it no longer ruled her. She could feel the weight of the child's hope, the echo of her mother's prayers, the steady strength of the man who, though battered, refused to yield. And she knew this fight was no longer about survival alone. It was about claiming a place in a world that had never once felt hers. The outlaw's grip tightened, and she lifted her chin, ready to face him. The moment stretched, brittle as glass, waiting for the next strike to shatter everything. The world seemed to hang suspended, the outlaw's hand bruising her wrist, the rancher struggling to rise despite his wound, the child's frightened sobs filling the air like a hymn of desperation. She drew in a breath so sharp it burned her chest, and with a sudden twist born of panic and something fiercer, she wrenched free. Her fingers closed around the cold metal of the shotgun propped by the door. She had never fired one in her life, but terror steadied her hands. She leveled at the man's chest, her heart a drumbeat in her ears. For an instant, silence claimed the yard. The outlaw's smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing as though assessing whether she was bluffing. She pressed her finger to the trigger. The blast shattered the stillness, the recoil slamming into her shoulder. She missed his chest, but his hat flew clean off his head, spinning into the dust. The men behind him erupted into raucous laughter, mocking their leader. The outlaw's face reddened, fury twisting his features. You will regret that girl, he spat, but the glint of uncertainty flickered in his gaze. The child laughed through her tears, the sound high and wild, like sunlight breaking through a storm. Even the rancher, hunched and bleeding, managed a hoarse chuckle. The moment of humor shifted the air, sharp as a blade yet strangely buoyant. She had not defeated him, not yet, but she had stripped away his invincibility. The standoff broke as the outlaws surged forward, chaos igniting like dry tinder. The rancher hauled himself to his feet, rifle in hand, firing with grim determination. Neighbors burst from hiding, weapons ready, answering his call for solidarity. Gunfire cracked like lightning, the smell of smoke thick in every breath. She loaded the shotgun with clumsy haste, hands shaking, then fired again, the sound rattling her bones. Dust churned as horses screamed, bullets whined past, and the yard transformed into a battlefield. She fought not with skill but with fury, each shot a cry against years of helplessness. When the outlaws pushed too close, she grabbed a burning torch from a fallen hand and flung it into a haystack. Flames leapt high, spreading with greedy speed, blocking the riders' path and forcing them into disarray. The smoke clawed at her throat, but she held her ground, coughing, eyes streaming. She had become a force the outlaws had not counted on, a woman with nothing left to lose but everything to protect. The fight raged until the raiders, battered and humiliated, broke into retreat. Their leader cursed, spitting promises of return, but his voice carried less conviction now. They thundered off across the plains, leaving behind the echo of hooves and the acrid bite of smoke. The yard lay scarred, trampled earth, broken fences, bloodied soil, but it still stood. The ranch still stood. Silence fell slowly, broken only by the crackle of fire dying into ash. She lowered the shotgun, her arms trembling, her knees weak. The child ran into her embrace, clinging tight, face pressed against her chest. Relief poured through her in shuddering waves, yet the terror still lingered in her blood, refusing to let go. The rancher limped toward them, his face pale, his body swaying with pain, but his eyes steady on hers. He stopped a breath away, his voice rough, laden with something unspoken. "You saved us." She shook her head, overwhelmed. Words caught her throat. It wasn't just saving them, she realized. It was saving herself, too, from insignificance, from fear, from the hollow ache of being unwanted. For the first time in her life, she had chosen to stand, to fight, and in that act, she had become more than a frightened girl with a satchel and a prayer. The days that followed carried the weight of healing. Fences were mended, wounds stitched, cattle gathered from the scrubland. The neighbors offered help, their nods of respect a quiet acknowledgment of her courage. She worked alongside them, shoulders sore, hands raw, but her spirit steadier than ever before. Each evening the rancher sat on the porch, his arm in a sling, watching her with a gaze that no longer hid behind walls of grief. He did not speak promises, not yet, but his silence carried an invitation. The child clung to her with unyielding devotion. At night she would curl against her, whispering, "Can you stay forever?" The question no longer pierced her with fear. It warmed her, filled her with a sense of belonging so fierce it nearly broke her. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, the woman brushed the child's hair back and answered softly, "I already am." The words settled into the air like a vow. The girl's eyes shone and the rancher's shoulders eased, as though a burden had finally lifted. In that moment she knew she had not come west to escape her past, but to claim her future. The West had tested her with hunger, fear, and fire, but had also given her something she had never dared to hope for, a family, fragile yet fierce, bound not by blood but by choice. As the stars emerged, cold and countless, she stood at the edge of the porch and breathed deep of the desert air. It smelled of dust, smoke, and survival. The horizon stretched wide, full of danger still, but also full of possibility. She was no longer a trembling girl who had stepped off the train clutching a satchel. She was a mother, a partner, a fighter, and the keeper of a home forged in fire. The narrator's voice seemed to rise with the wind, reflective and steady. Out here, the West would break a soul or forge into steel. She had come terrified, uncertain, lost. She stayed as something stronger, a woman remade, a family reborn. And to those who listened, who felt the echo of her journey, the voice offered one last invitation. If the story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments.